I've been reading some things in the paper and various press releases that Senator Yarborough is not too happy with the way the Democratic Party is going nationwide and Texas-wise. Governor Briscoe has all but nominated Lloyd Bentsen for president. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think much of it. I think the Democratic Party should nominate people who've stood up for the Democratic Party and fought for the Democratic Party when the going was rough, like 1952 when Senator Bentsen endorsed Eisenhower for president. Eisenhower's a great person. I admired him greatly. Served under him as a staff officer of an infantry division in World War II, but I'm a Democrat, a staunch Democrat. And then last year, rather in '72, in September, right in the closing weeks, you might say, of the campaign when the issues were drawn and when everybody knew that Watergate had happened, Wright-Patman was trying to get an investigation and was being suppressed by some dissident Democrats who joined with the Republicans to prevent the full facts being brought out. But all the politicians in Washington knew what had happened. Despite that, Senator Bentsen came on Air Force One with President Nixon to Laredo and Harlingen. That's now in 2 congressional districts, but it was in Senator Bentsen's old congressional district. And knowing the campaign is on, flew down there and said later he didn't know it was non-political. Now, if a man didn't know that, and then he refunded the price of the ticket. Now, if a man didn't know that as a political broadcast and is a political trip when he's in the United States Senate, he's just not qualified to be president.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the fact that the Governor Ralph Briscoe is putting so much behind Senator Bentsen will have anything to do with the nomination coming up at the Democratic Convention?
Oh, I don't. I think the Democratic Party, you're talking about 1976.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Democratic Party will nominate people who stood with the party when the going was rough, when we were losing. Oh, it's easy to find the sunshine patriots and summer soldiers who'll stand up there and cheer when the weather's warm and no battle going on, but when the cold winds of November blow and you see the vote slipping away, the people who stand to it and fight then, and either party of the ones honored should be honored by that party. And I just can't see the Democratic Party nominating somebody who stabbed it in the back when the going was rough.
Mm-hmm. What about Ted Kennedy? You've spoken about saying that Ted Kennedy would have a good chance of getting the nomination. I read a letter to the editor in Saturday's American Statesman of someone, I can't remember the person's name, who didn't feel that Ted Kennedy was qualified to be president of the United States. How do you feel about that?
Well, I didn't endorse Senator Kennedy for the presidency. It's my choice. I'm uncommitted. I merely put that release out to show what the polls showed. For some strange reason, when the Gallup poll showed that Ted Kennedy, if nominated, right now was leading Jerry Ford, vice president, by a percentage of 50% to 39%, that he was leading Jerry Ford in the South by a percentage of 49% to 40%, that if you excluded the black voters, Ted Kennedy was leading Jerry Ford in the South with white voters only by a vote of 47% to 41%. Now, this was a rather startling poll, and many papers in Texas normally carry the Gallup poll, but when this showed Kennedy being overwhelmingly winning against Jerry Ford for some strange reason, most of the papers dropped it. I get a number of large Sunday daily newspapers in Texas on Sunday only, and checking them, I didn't find it until the next day. A Texas lawyer in New York on some business phoned me and said, "My goodness, did you see that poll?" Mm-hmm. He'd seen it in the New York Times. I didn't, but 2 or 3 days later, someone mailed me a copy of the Washington Post with the poll. So I issued the press release to get before the people of Texas what the Gallup poll showed, what so many newspapers refused to print when it showed Ted Kennedy winning so big.
Mm-hmm. Also in the South, there was a Gallup poll out this morning that we've been talking about this morning since I came on, concerning congressional elections, and it showed that about 60% of the people favor Democrats over Republicans in congressional elections. Does that say to you that the Democrats are going to take over Congress and a veto-proof Congress?
Well, I think so. Of course, the Democrats have the overwhelming majority of members, of titular members who say they're Democrats now. But they like to jump on Air Force One with people who vote as reactionary as Richard Nixon in the election year and run around with him. They frisk along behind Nixon kind of like a bunch of jackals following along behind a lion, hoping to pick up some of the droppings after he's made the kill. And I think that we're going to come out of this next election with more real Democrats who will vote for the people of this country and not for just big fat cat promoters alone.
A former Democrat who is now a Republican, who down through the years has not been one of your favorites, if I read the newspapers right, John Connally has got to play some part in the election coming up. I say in the election coming up, in the elections to come up. What part will John Connally being a Republican play in Texas, do you think?
Well, I don't think it will have a great influence on the voters in Texas. I do get a number of letters from people who say, I've never voted for you in my life, but you're dead right about Connally. And then people who had supported him very avidly in the past and expressing dismay that he would betray the party that gave him the great honor of being first Secretary of Navy and then Governor of Texas.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of unusual to me because you have Robert Strauss as a National Democratic chairman, and Robert Strauss down through the years has been a very big John Connally supporter. What does that say about Robert Strauss as the Democratic head?
Well, I think that John Connally, though a Republican, now has more influence in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party because he put Strauss in as chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He raised the money, the $6.5 million, to elect Lloyd Bentsen to the United States Senate. And Bentsen is chairman of the senatorial campaign fundraising activities. So he's got in two top jobs of raising money for the Democratic Party, two of those great big giver lovers, Senator Bentsen and Chairman Strauss. Connally has tremendous influence organizationally in the Democratic Party, but with the rank and file voters of Texas, I think his influence is gone.
Mm-hmm. Republicans are saying that it's going to be a bad year every time an election comes up. You think it's going to be a bad year in the next few years for Republicans as a result of Watergate? Or is it, are Democrats being over enthusiastic about Watergate? You think it's
I think it depends on what the Democratic Party does. If the Democratic Party will act responsibly and legislate for the benefit of the people of this country, it'll be very bad for the Republicans. It was bad for the Democrats when the Republicans got in. But Nixon so conducted the office, he's thrown away any credibility the Republican Party has as a party. Now, I don't think the Republican Party is destroyed. I think either party is bigger than any one man, and I think the Republican Party will rebuild, but it's going to take them a long time to regain the confidence of the people because the Nixon administration destroyed confidence in every direction, and the financial peculation was minor compared to their threat to the institutions of democracy, free nominations, free elections, the infiltration of the other party. And Senator McGovern's told me that they had members of that, the CREEP so-called, the Committee to Re-elect the President, that had secret spies were infiltrated him in practically every headquarters he had in the country in the fall of 1972 and did everything they could to disrupt his campaign from the inside, insulting people. And they would find out, and as soon as they could get some cleaned out, there'd be others there. This thing of infiltrating the other party and trying to destroy its mechanism is un-American, it's undemocratic. It destroys the decencies of our democracy if permitted to continue.
You're somewhat of a historian. You've studied quite a bit of Texas history and national history. In studying history, can you remember any time in the nation's or even in the state's history where something like Watergate would happen, something as dramatic as has been the Watergate scandal?
No, never before. There were great financial irregularities by cabinet officers under General Grant and under President Harding. From the study of history, and I've talked to historians who are professional historians, put in the full time, they're convinced that General Grant had no part in that, knew nothing about it, was crushed by it, that Warren Harding was crushed by it. At the time Harding died, if you permit this personal reference, I was a student at the University of Texas. He was on the Alaskan trip. Radio, such as you have now, was limited to a few crystal headsets. Students had those, and a few had them, and they'd come out on the campus and spread the word of what they heard. Well, there was a wild rumor over the campus that Harding had died 1 week before he died, and he wasn't even sick. He came back to San Francisco, suddenly was taken sick and died. And some say that he'd found out how he'd been betrayed by some of his cabinet officers with the oil deal and other things that had contributed to his death, helped kill him. So I do not believe there's ever been a time in the history of this country before when a president went so far as to attempt to subvert the institutions of democracy. Now, I don't think Richard Nixon's the first man to ever have wiretaps around there, and I don't think he's the first president ever to record conversations with people in the White House. Everybody in the Senate knew that was going on long before Richard Nixon. But I will say this, he is the most amazing president of all. Why he'd keep those wiretaps with all that incriminating evidence, as a lawyer, it baffles any lawyer. He'd pile up, he would go record evidence against himself and carefully preserve it for the public.
Senator, could you support George Wallace, Ted Kennedy ticket, or Ted Kennedy, George Wallace ticket?
I think that's such a iffy question. That's way off, years off. I don't think it'll ever happen, but we don't know. There's been a great metamorphosis in George Wallace since he was shot down by a would-be killer and lay in that hospital and was nursed back to life by nuns and treated by black attendants. He's had a great influence on his life, but we don't know what will happen in the next 3 years. And when it comes to specific tickets, it's impossible to say here in 1973 what a ticket would be, what a person what would happen in 76. I think that question's President Roosevelt used to say is just too iffy to answer.
Okay, let's move along. This time last year, you were going across the state trying to find out answers to what the citizens of Texas are looking for in a Constitution, in the Constitutional Revision Commission, of which you were a member. What do you think the work of the Constitutional Convention, the delegates, the legislature delegates, have done to the work of the Constitutional Revision Commission?
Well, they have pretty well torn up what we did as Constitutional Revision Commission. Some of theirs is, I think, better, and some I think is worse. It's, in many provisions, been very disappointed. In some, I'm elated to see it done. But they are not through, and I'm hopeful they'll still improve some of the worst things that they have put in the document at this time.
Let's talk about the better. What things have they done better that the
better things? Well, they have one thing in here that I think is better. They have put in this Constitution is Section 24 of the General Provisions section, the latter part of the Constitution, right to health care. It says, every resident of Texas shall have access to adequate, comprehensive health care as provided by law. Now, it doesn't give anybody health care or sell anybody health care. It's left up to the legislature to do it in the future, but there's certain interests in this state that think that health care belongs to them as a proprietary right. This states as a constitutional principle that citizens have a right to health care. I think that's a great forward thing. There's a provision into providing for rights of the handicapped people. Some disappointments in this same provision. We of the Constitutional Revision Commission had a provision about protecting the environment. Too weak. We requested that they strengthened it. They watered it down to 3 lines, practically nothing, and then put Section 8, Development of Natural Resources, and turned the environment around into a matter to make money out of. Now, Justice William O. Douglas, Supreme Court, in his great book, Goodbye to Texas, The Vanishing Wilderness, states that in many weeks of work in Texas getting material for that book, he heard every facet of natural resources in Texas when he talked to people. Every single one of them was talked about by the people he talked with in the terms of how much money they could make out of it, except one. And he said that was those beautiful sunsets in Texas, and he didn't believe it'd be long before somebody would figure out a way to make money out of those too. But this Constitution, I thought that was a rather harsh judgment of us Texans, but this Constitution almost proves it. It says the quality of the environment of the state of Texas is to be protected. The legislature by law shall implement and enforce this policy. That's all it says. Then there are 23 lines on development of natural resources, in other words, how to make money out of this. Then we had a provision we fought for and didn't succeed on, open beaches. So the committee, this committee came out of this Constitutional Convention meeting in the Capitol with a very fine open beaches provision. That's changed now to coastal natural resources. And like that other section, development of natural resources, it deals more with how you can make money out of these beaches. And you read in there, one place they talk about a public beach, but they have screened out as though these words were words of treason or something you couldn't mention. You can read all of that, those lines, and there are over 20 lines of them, and they never use the term open beaches in there. It looked like they decided that the lobby says we're not going to let you mention open beaches in Texas. You can have a public beach, and it's very limited. It's limited only to the Gulf side of the Gulf. Now, We got our law of the waters, our navigable rivers. Any river that's 30 feet wide in Texas is navigable under the law of Texas. We got that from Spain and Mexico. And when we adopted the English common law in the Republic of Texas in 1840, we kept that law about navigable waters from the laws of Mexico and Spain and Rome. That went right back to the Partidas of Spain in the 1500s and to the Roman Empire, where the beaches and bays and rivers were open to the people. And this grants something, protects something, but it gives away a lot too. So those are disappointments. You have to read past that coastal natural resources to find what it is, but it is something. And this is the most improved part of the Constitution than the general provisions. I think the worst part are in taxes. They've got the biggest tax loopholes ever written into a constitution in Texas. We talk about tax loopholes in Washington. They've really written them into this Constitution. And the disappointing thing is we see great discussion by the news media of the environment, the coastal natural resources of the open beaches, of the public beaches, these questions, the branch banking, lotteries and all, but virtually none of taxes. Now, taxes, some people say, is the name of the game. It's what we pay to live, to maintain our fire and police protection, our schools and all. They've got tax loopholes in here. For example, one is to, over in East Texas, let the big lumber companies, the big timber companies have a lower rate of taxation than they now have, written it into the Constitution, giving the legislature that power. Another provides that the land may be taxed on its productivity only, not its value. For example, if you have a city like Austin or Houston, other rapidly growing cities, promoters can buy up vast acreages on the edge of a city, and if all it'll produce are cedar posts or grass, all the taxes they have to pay on that is the value of the grass or the cedar post it'll produce. And they can hold that for years, stymie the growth of a city, and let the citizens who own homes or rent houses, either one they're paying taxes, the people that live there bear the heavy tax burden while those promoters sit there scot-free, stymie the growth of a city, pay virtually no taxes, just what's your grass worth, what are your cedar posts worth, till the city has grown around it, then reap enormous unearned profits by not having borne their share of the cost of the government while the land was increasing in price due to the growth of a city around it.
What did the revision committee, the revision commission do in this area, tax loopholes?
We didn't, we had a minor one. We had one that was disputed. I didn't think that it was good enough. I had a minority position seeking a stronger constitution on that. I thought what the commission itself did, we did was weaker than the present constitution. But the convention's just gone hog wild on creating loopholes for vast aggregations of wealth.
Yeah. Let's talk about that some more. I've got the telephone ringing. Let's take some questions. My guest this morning, former Senator Ralph Yarborogh. If you have a question about the Constitution, about anything that would concern the senator, in San Marcos, 392-9929.
9% of the agriculture.
Inquisitorial grand jury, is there enough evidence to bind this man over? Is there enough evidence to vote for an impeachment, which means for a trial or a hearing as to whether he's guilty or not? It is not their function to take over, not the function of the House Judiciary Committee or the House of Representatives, to take over the functions of the Senate, which is the court, and to be presided over by the Chief Justice of the United States. That's the court. It seems to me that the House committee, and to some extent from the comments I see, members of the House think they're the court to try the president, and then he'll be tried again in the Senate. That is not the constitutional way to proceed. The House merely decides, is there anything to this? Is this very serious? Is it substantiated by substantial evidence? And if so, prosecute or indict, or we impeach. Impeachment does not mean that the president is guilty. The presumption of innocence goes with impeachment just as it does with the presumption of innocence when a man's indicted until he's convicted, unless he's convicted by the Senate. I think they have some confusion in what their true function under the Constitution is, and they're dragging it out like a trial when that is not their function.
Latest Gallup poll, Senator, says 57% of the voters questioned say they would prefer to have Democrats represent their districts in Congress. 30% say they favor Republicans. That poll was taken in May and June. The results are little change from a poll on the same subject in January. Back in January, the Republicans received 29% of the vote and Democrats 58%. Gallup spokesman said the Republicans' ratings in the latest two polls were the lowest national figures ever recorded in that organization's 38 years of measuring congressional party preference. Regionally, the poll showed the South to be the leading Democratic stronghold. Among the Southern voters, 61% preferred Democrats. Any comment on that?
Yes, well, I think that the fact that this is the lowest point in public esteem that a government's ever recorded in a Gallup poll is earned by the fact of the misdeeds of this administration. It's not merely failure. Herbert Hoover failed in the sense of economically he couldn't avert this terrible depression, but it was worldwide. But there was no question of Herbert Hoover's high integrity, high character. This goes to the integrity, the honesty, and the dishonesty of this administration, the failure to tell the truth under fire, the ambivalence of it. You just can't pin them down to one thing. If they try one defense and it fails, they'll tell a different tale. They'll do everything. It's gotten so bad that some of the members are now beginning to confess their parts. This is something White House staffer would never do in the past. Whether he thought the president was right or wrong, either party, the White House staffer wouldn't go out and tell about it. But it's stricken their conscience so when they see what they've done to this country that they're beginning to turn state's evidence on the president for what he led them into, what he ordered them to do. And if anyone who has lived in Washington knows anything about the government, to say that all of this could go on in the White House and the president not know it is the most ridiculous assertion they've ever made. Why, this would just be like General Eisenhower commanding the armies in Europe when the Germans broke through up there, said, well, nobody told me, I didn't know they broke through. The commander-in-chief knows more about what's going on in his army, and the president in Washington knows more in that White House about what's going on than anybody else in this country, and certainly knows what his own staff's doing. That's being revealed more and more by these undecipherable tapes as they decipher them and find out. Of course, we don't know what was on there that's been erased. That's been found. They've erased part of them to cover it up, but I've heard some lawyers who practice criminal law, I'm not an expert in that field myself, said that anybody that practiced criminal law would have had sense enough to burn those tapes the first time they listened at them. That has astonished more people who know a little about government in this country than anything else for the president to be willing to go down in history as a man with this low sense of responsibility, this low sense of ethics, this low sense of observance of law, and a low sense of what is due of a man in a position of leadership. It's without precedent in the history of the country, and that's what's driven the Republican Party down to this poor showing in the polls.
Mm-hmm. President Nixon wraps up some last-minute domestic matters in Washington today before leaving on his European tour. Returning from a secluded weekend at Camp David, Maryland retreat, the president meets with his top economic advisors this morning for a report on the economy. Tomorrow, the president leaves for Brussels in consultations with representatives of the NATO allies. He is due to sign a declaration on Atlantic relations. On Thursday, the president goes on to Moscow for a third summit meeting with party leader Brezhnev in Moscow. What do you think of the president's return to Moscow?
Well, I think one thing that the president has done, for which he's entitled to great credit, is the attempt to normalize our relations with Russia and China. You know, we've had a cult in this country that's been advocating a war with either Russia or China. Thank goodness they haven't advocated a war with both of them at the same time, but they feel we've just got to get in every war that comes along, and if one doesn't come along, we'll go start one ourselves. And we've had that mental attitude by a lot of people in high government positions in Washington ever since World War II, that we've just got to be in a war, and that's what's really pulled this economy down. In the Saturday Review of Literature of December 1972, it stated the war in Vietnam had cost us $300 billion. Now, as bad as Watergate is, this effort to blame everything that's happened in the economy on Watergate is like an ostrich sticking its head in the sand. We as Americans ought to face up to what's caused this debacle with our economy, what's caused the basic underlying cause of the flight of the dollar and the decline of the dollar in the market of the world and the high interest rates and the poor economic showing. It's the $300 billion squandered in Southeast Asia, just blown up, blown away, as we've killed millions of people there and killed innocent civilians, killed and maimed together many millions. We have blown our own economy out, the vast cost of it and the senselessness of it. And that is the thing that has hurt the nation in the eyes of the world more than anything else. And as a president, if he can loosen those tensions somewhat, it will be beneficial to the world. Of course, if they make secret deals that they do not report to the Congress of the United States, it would be bad. It would be the worst thing he could do. And that's been charged, and there seems to be some substance back of it. I hope that that is cleared away. I hope they don't do that, because I think it was a favorable sign that we were beginning to normalize our relations and recognize that the 600 million people of China and the 250 million people of Russia were as much entitled to have the kind of government they wanted as we're entitled to have our free and open economy here.
The weather forecast for San Marcos and Austin: partly sunny and hot through tomorrow. Wind should be northeasterly at 8 to 16. High today for the area of 91, low tonight of 65. Now we have partly clear skies in the area, about 75 degrees. That was news and commentary from KRMH. Let's take some questions now. Those numbers again are 392-9926 in San Marcos. In Austin, 477-2251. Music from the Byrds, as suggested earlier this morning. Good morning to you. It's 15 minutes away from 9 o'clock. You're with Art Young, KRMH. My guest this morning, former Senator Ralph Yarborogh, talking about, at this moment, the Constitutional Convention. And before we go on, Senator, lots of telephone calls this morning of people saying that it's nice to hear you back on the radio and out and about. Lots of friends out there from the days gone by and now, of course. Back to the Constitution. Were you happy with the way the delegates handled the education article?
Well, I think that their handling of that was less subject to criticism than most other provisions of the Constitution. I won't say most, but many of them, such as those I've mentioned earlier. It's a very a difficult question, of course, because more money goes out of the state taxes for education than any other one purpose. And it's close to the hearts of the people. We need to do a lot. We're 31st in this nation in education, in this state. And we're 31st also in average annual per capita income. The history of the country shows that no state will ever raise very high its average annual per capita income above its educational level. We like to think of education as something that stimulates the mind of man, lets him have a higher living, but it's closely tied to materialism too, because he improves his income as he improves his education. Now, we can't continue to lag along 31st in this nation when our state annual product per year is worth $45 billion, exceeded by only that of New York and California. They're in the top 10 states in the Union. We must have a better educational opportunity for the people of this state. One great failing in that holds Texas down is the fact that so many pupils drop out before they reach the 8th grade, and after they've graduated from the 8th grade, only about half of those who graduate from the 8th grade graduate from high school. In California and Illinois, I mention those states because they each have over 10 million populations similar to Texas, large numbers of Mexican Americans, California more than we have, large numbers of blacks. Their ethnic composition is not too dissimilar from that in Texas, and in those states, a high percentage graduate of the students from the 8th grade, and then over 85% who finish the 8th grade graduate from high school. We don't give the students motivation to go ahead and get a high school education. And we've not had enough trade and vocational schools, and not enough community colleges that include those subjects. And we have failed miserably in education in Texas vis-a-vis the other powerful states. I mean powerful in resources, because none exceed Texas in the value of their natural resources. We produce 23% of the mineral wealth of the nation alone, one of the 3 great ones in agriculture. We've moved up in farming, in products from the sea, the fisheries. We're among the top 2 states in the Union. So with all this vast resources, we have been done very poorly with education. And that made that a controversial subject. I wouldn't have written some the same way, and we debated over that. It was a very sharp issue on our Constitutional Revision Commission. But I think with the problems they had, they did as well with that as any article they have.
Mm-hmm. Governor Briscoe had his strong arm, so to speak, on the executive article a couple of days ago. Are you happy with the way that executive article turned out, to where the governor still has the power of calling the legislature in?
Well, I'm not as happy or unhappy as I'm amazed. I'm amazed that the legislature just turned around like 6-year-old children attending a public school for the first time, and when the teacher sneezed, practically crawled under the desk. Briscoe says, "I'm not happy," and they all ran back in and reversed the votes to make him happy. I don't mean all, but a large number of them. And this, while they claimed their co-equal body, they exhibited right there their subserviency to the executive. Now, the executive has this claim of the past. The executive had no power was changed the minute the governor was given a 4-year term. And the legislature has broadened his powers vastly. I don't think it's wise. I think Watergate shows the unwisdom of it. Because right now, when a governor is sworn in at the beginning of a first term, everybody in the state that knows anything about government knows that under the Constitution, within 27 months, he'll have a two-thirds majority on every state board that's appointed. And they're all appointed except the Railroad Commission. So with this vast powers in his hand that no past governors had with two-year terms, it's already become a very powerful office. And the legislature didn't have to roll over and play dead and give him all these additional powers to make it a powerful office. So if you're going to keep a co-equal branch, Washington shows the utter failure of the co-equal provision due to weak-kneed Congresses rolling over and playing dead when the president said, I want something. And we see the end product now with too much power vested in one office. If we vest that power in one office in Texas, there'll be trouble somewhere down the line. I don't mean immediately. Governors will get accustomed to using it first. But somewhere down the line, Texas will rue the day that it's put too much power in one office, one branch of the government.
Mm-hmm. A lot of people that were on the Constitutional Revision Commission at the very beginning of this process said that legislature, elected officials of the government had no business writing the Constitution. People from Louisiana felt the same way. Consequently, they didn't have all of their legislators writing the Constitution. At the, of course, hindsight's best. Whenever you have hindsight, it's always easier to speculate on hindsight. But looking at it from hindsight, you think it would have been better had the delegates to the Constitution been non-elected officials?
I think that the delegates to the Constitution should have been elected by the people, but I would not have barred public officials. I would have let legislators, judges, any have been eligible. After all, the best Constitution in America is the federal Constitution. And of that Constitution, of the 55 who wrote it, a number, some 16, I believe, or just about that number, maybe a few more or less, were members of the Continental Congress at the time, and more than a score of others had served in the Constitutional Convention. I do not think a Constitutional Convention should exclude those who have had public service or those in public service at the time. Conversely, I don't think that it should be limited only to the legislative body and exclude all the other 11 million people of Texas. I think it should be broad-based and give people with different backgrounds and different jobs in life. After all, these legislators have one job now. They are legislators. And I think that bars too many people of different experiences and attitudes. I think it might have been well to have had some political scientists in there, some newsmen, some farmers, some businessmen, educators, a broad general. We on the commission had a very broad general grouping in the state, and I think that was one reason why we had as good a document as it did. It wasn't perfect. I wasn't satisfied with all of it. I don't think any member was. It was a result of compromise. But we did have two or three or four farm and ranch leaders. We had 3 union labor leaders. We had 8 women out of 37. We had 3 blacks and 3 Mexican Americans, and some young people and older people and businessmen and retired people and lawyers and judges and university presidents and deans of law schools. We had a broad cross-section of the state, and I think that's helpful in a convention.
Mm-hmm. In that commission, you had to go across Texas, of course, getting the feel of people in the state regarding a constitution. With the document that you see emerging from the convention now, do you think it's going to pass?
I'm unable to answer that. First place, I haven't decided what I'll do about it. I've not decided to vote against it. I've not decided to vote for it. They're changing it constantly. I want to see what finally comes out. As I've stated to you, some of these provisions I'm very much in favor of. Others I'm dismayed to see in there. The greatest disappointment I have is what they did with taxes, the big tax loopholes they're creating, because that burden's going to come right back on the backs of an overtaxed people in Texas right now. The burden on the middle class people are paying the taxes in this country, most of them. The poor are paying very heavy taxes too, but due to their low income, they can't pay as much. But with heavy sales taxes and high rents, when they pay high rents, they're paying taxes. They pay a heavier percentage of the income than anyone else, but the tax burden's falling on the middle class America, mainly the so-called middle class. That's no longer white-collar workers. Your union labor man working in a factory earns as much as or more than the average white-collar worker. but they're middle class, and that they're the people paying the taxes. That's true of the federal government as well as state and local governments. And when we exempt vast combinations of wealth, we put that burden right back on the homeowner and the small rancher and farmer who has to work his ranch and farm for a living and not a weekend a vacation resort place. We put that burden back on the small businessman. We force him to the wall and and bring about the forming of more conglomerates and more concentrated economic enterprise, which is bad for the political and the economic and the social climate of the country.
Let's take a break, Senator. You have a question for former Senator Ralph Yarborogh in San Marcos. The number is 3 phone and failed to have a long record to talk over. If you're just joining us, my guest this morning, former Senator Ralph Yarborogh, and you're with Art Young and KRMH, and we got just a little time and lots of questions that people have called in. Maybe we can just get some quick answers. I want to talk a little bit about the Big Thicket, though, because in the past I know Senator Ralph Yarborogh has been one of the original people to start trying to save the Big Thicket in East Texas, and worked a lot of hours and worked very hard on trying to get the Big Thicket into a national park. How stands that legislation now, Senator?
A bill's been passed by the Senate calling for a Big Thicket National Park of National Biological Reserve, 100,000 acres, won by the House for 84,550 acres. The House bill provided that the Congress pay for it now and get the land before it's destroyed. The Senate bill did not include that provision. It's left up for conference. The most disappointing thing is that the conference hasn't been called. That Senate bill passed the last week in May, the House bill last December. If people really want to pass a bill, they can have a conference a week after they're passed. That conference should have moved the first week of June to the second week of June. Both the House and the Senate are dragging their feet on it. It looks like they're dragging it along, hoping that something like will get in the way. If they wait till the impeachment hearing starts, either the House or the Senate, it might be lost. It's incumbent on those who say they're for it, if they're really for it, to pick it up and pass it.
Mm-hmm. The Big Thicket National Park is being, the majority of the legislative work has been being done by Bob Eckhart now, isn't it?
Well, in the House, Bob Eckhart and Charles Wilson. Mm-hmm. In the Senate, while Senator Benson and Senator Tower have authored bills for 100,000 acres park, the bulk of the work has been done by Senator Henry Jackson, chairman of the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, and Senator Alan Bible of Nevada, who's chairman of the Parks Subcommittee. Neither Senator Tower or Senator Benson are on either of those committees. And so those two senators who passed most of the national park bills for the past decades, Senators Bible and Senator Henry Jackson. Senator Henry Jackson has sponsored the wilderness areas and the wild rivers and more national parks than any other senator in the history of this nation. And they helped me pass 2. We have 3 in Texas. I created 2 of them, the Padre Island and Guadalupe Mountains, but with Senator Henry Jackson's driving help on both. And he drove the bill through to create a Big Thicket National Park in the Senate for me in 1970 before I left, and has been pushing this, but it hasn't moved this past 30 days.
Mm-hmm. In the last Travis County election, there were some voter irregularities. One of those elections is being contested as a result of Republicans voting in the Democratic primary, allegedly voting in the Democratic primary. Those come up for trial sometime soon. In your past experience, was there ever a case that you could document where there's this kind of crossover voting going on in the primary?
Oh, there's been monumental crossover votings in my elections. The Dallas News and other papers have wrote editorials urging people to go into the urging Republicans to go into Democratic primaries and vote against me, and then if they didn't win, then they could still vote Republican in November and get 2 shots at my defeat. This has been urged by big newspapers brazenly and openly in their editorials. We have no party purity law in Texas. We have one if you vote in the first primary in the party, and then as these cases move over in the second primary, but that's minimal. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands. Most states in the Union, all but a very few states, have a law that requires that a person vote, they register as Democrats or Republicans or Raza Unida or Independent or whatever they want to register as. But in the primaries, they can vote only in the party in which registered. Of course, that doesn't bind anybody in the general election. We need such a party purity law. We'll never have progressive government in this state, and we'll never have honest politics until we have a party purity law. As long as vast segments of the news media urge people to go into a party not of their own belief and choice and vote to try to beat somebody, we'll have dishonest politics in Texas.
Senator, as always, I've got